As you recall from our jury selections, my name is Bonnie Johnson, and I'm an assistant state attorney assigned to prosecute this case. John Krumholz is at the table, and over the course of the next week, we will be putting on evidence in this case. You are here for a case entitled The State of Florida versus Joseph Abels. Mr. Abels is charged in this case with 2 criminal counts. The court read the indictment. The first count is first-degree murder. The second count is cruelty to animals. And before I get started going into what I believe the evidence will show, I want to introduce you to somebody. It's somebody that you'll hear about many times in the trial. You won't hear from him as a witness, and you won't see him in person. It is William Jackson Gentry, Jr., Deputy Sheriff from Highlands County. He started his law enforcement career in around 2005. He was a road deputy, canine officer. His end of watch came at approximately 7:50 p.m. on May 6th, 2018, while on a call for service to investigate the shooting of a pet cat. This incident occurred in Lake Placid, to the left of 27, in a neighborhood generally called Placid Lakes. The address where this occurred was 234 Baltimore Way in Lake Placid. That was the residence of the defendant, Joseph Edward Abels. Zooming in, you can see 234 Baltimore Way at the bottom of the screen. And you can see another house number diagonally and to the north. Adjacent to the defendant's house, the evidence will show a neighbor to the northeast at 345 Chicago Way. That neighbor was a lady named Susan Naylor. Miss Naylor lived alone with her 13-year-old cat, Mr. Brown. Miss Naylor had lived in that house approximately 4 years before this incident, and Mr. Brown lived with her the entire time. Miss Naylor had been painting her home over the course of the week before, but she would do it in sections. Paint the front section. She's a little bit older, so she would pace herself, go around to the other side and paint that part, get to the garage door and paint that section. But on the evening of May 6th, 2018, she had made it around to the side of her house that faced Mr. Abels' house. And she was finishing up her day's painting around 7:25 in the evening. And of course, she was accompanied by Mr. Brown, who would help her paint the house, roll around in the yard and do things that cats do. As she was finishing up, Mr. Brown was between the bushes at the side of the house. And the evidence will show that Mr. Abels' house can be seen in the back with the blue tarp on it. And around 7:24 that evening, she heard a pop. She describes it, and will describe it, I believe, as a BB gun or like a .22. And it came from the direction of the house with the blue tarp. Mr. Brown immediately flew off the ground and began to flop around, as probably folks can imagine an animal sustaining an injury like that would do. She picked him up, sat on the ground and cried. The cat died in her arms. So with what little forensics she had, hearing the noise coming from that direction and her cat suddenly dying, she walked over to her neighbor's house. Her house is up in the upper right-hand corner with the brown roof. And she'll testify along the grass path of her neighbor, her other neighbor, Barbara Moriarty. She is also a widow that lives alone. Into the backyard of Mr. Abels, up the side of the garage and around to the front door. Front door has a screen porch, and inside of that screen door there's another main door to the house, and the porch is fairly small. She knocked on the screen door, and after a couple of minutes she opened the screen door, saw the welcome mat on the floor, knocked on the interior door, all the while holding Mr. Brown in her arms. The door eventually opened, and she stood there sobbing and asked Mr. Abels, "Did you shoot my cat?" She'll testify that Mr. Abels empathetically looked at her and said, "No, I had nothing to do with it. I didn't kill your cat. I'm so sorry." He suggested that it was the blacks down the road, using a different term, who were probably responsible for the death of her cat. He then reached out, and she'll testify that he began to stroke her arm to console her over this dead cat that she held in her arms, compassionately telling her, "I'm so sorry. I didn't kill your cat. I'm so sorry. I had nothing to do with Mr. Brown's death." And as he comforted her and rubbed her arm, in the back bedroom of his house was a powerful pellet rifle with a scope on it that was discovered later by the detectives. It was behind the bedroom door of that back master bedroom. The windows that face Miss Naylor's house. That weapon was collected later by detectives and sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. The pellet was extracted out of the back of the cat during the necropsy, and it was compared ballistically to that firearm. And Corey Nerzig of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, he now does the same thing that he did there as a firearms analyst, tool mark analyst. They both look at the ballistic rifling of weapons, but they also do tool mark examinations if a gun is like a semi-automatic and it forces the compression inside of the chamber, and it makes microscopic marks. If you've ever looked at a wedding ring or something under a microscope, it looks nice now, but it's all full of nicks. It's those unique nicks that they look at. He is currently a firearms examiner for the ATF, and he compared the rifling on the pellet to test fires that he did on that same weapon. And he will testify with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that that is the weapon that killed Mr. Brown. Susan Naylor, with a cat in her arm, walked back in the same direction to her house. Now, shortly returning home at around 7:30, Mrs. Naylor spoke with her neighbor briefly and then called her daughter and her son-in-law, who live in Sebring, just about 7 miles up the road. Ms. Naylor called her daughter and her husband, Russell Pites, and told her what happened and how upset she was. So the two of them immediately jumped in the car and they raced down to her mother and his mother-in-law's house to console her. And when they got home to her house, she showed the two of them Mr. Brown and told them what happened, or what appeared to have happened. And Russell said, you know, you need to call 911. Never mind, I'll take care of it. And he called 911 so that a deputy could come out and take a report about what had happened. That was at about 7:40 in the evening. Also at 7:40 in the evening, a man named Mario Santos, who lives about a half a mile up the road, he got a phone call too. Wasn't from Russell Pites. It was from Joseph Abels. Joseph Abels had this acquaintance friend in the neighborhood named Mario Santos. They had known each other at that point about a year or so. And their meeting came kind of happenstance, as Mario Santos, he's about 74, 75, likes to keep in shape. He's a former Porsche mechanic, loves race cars, motorcycles, moved to this area. Of course, we have Sebring, we have raceways, we have race cars, and sort of retired up here from Miami. But he would ride his bike every day with his dog on a leash. And one day, about a year before this incident, he was wearing a Porsche shirt, motorcycle-y car shirt. Mr. Abels saw that in the front yard and flagged him down. Mr. Abels, too, likes cars and motorcycles. So the two of them had something in common. Now, I'm not going to stand here and say that this was a great friendship, but the two of them communicated with each other. Mr. Santos would ride by on his bicycle and they'd say hello. Mr. Santos was asked by Mr. Abels, could you clean the spark plug in my riding lawnmower? Now, remember, Mr. Santos is a mechanic, so he's got a lot of stuff in his garage, like bead blasters to clean off a spark plug, things like that. Help me fix my mower. My car battery, Mr. Abels told him, just keeps draining. What do I do? Mr. Santos would come over and check the car with his diagnostic equipment and say, you don't have any leaks here, you just need a new battery. Go to the store with him and help put the battery in. Irma comes along. And notice the blue tarps. Mr. Santos lost part of his roof too. Now they have that in common. Maybe we can help each other and put metal roofs on these houses and maybe this won't happen again. Mr. Santos didn't get the call. It went to voicemail at 7:40. Going back to Russell Pites, deputies are dispatched from his 7:40 call to 911. Deputies are dispatched, and there's Mr. Santos, and I didn't click ahead far enough, and Mr. Abels. And now 2 deputies are dispatched to Ms. Naylor's house. Erica Lavender, now Erica Lavender Adams, and William Jackson Gentry, Jr. And they show up and they pull down the road heading east, and they park between Ms. Naylor's house and Ms. Moriarty's house, right in the middle. There's a couple trees in there. But they arrive in a fully marked Highlands County Sheriff's Office SUV, the one with the green and the yellow on the side, and a bar of lights across the top. They're wearing deputy uniforms. Patches on both shoulders, a star here, a nameplate, radios, a gun belt with all the different things that go on it. And they meet Ms. Naylor, her son-in-law, and her daughter in the front yard, right in the area that you see there where the Deputy Lavender's picture is. So, after discussing what has happened, Deputy Gentry, who was the senior of the two deputies, and in fact, at the time, while a full deputy, Deputy Lavender was still a trainee, where you have to ride with someone for a certain period of time before they kind of cut you loose on your own. And Deputy Gentry said, you know, stay here and take a statement from the Naylors. Just calm them down, talk to them. I'll walk over and I'll go talk to this Mr. Abels next door, see what he has to say. So, William Gentry, Deputy Sheriff, took roughly the same path that Miss Naylor did, from Miss Naylor's house through the back of Miss Moriarty's side yard into the backyard of Mr. Abel's property, along the side and around the front of the garage up to the same front door that Miss Naylor had knocked on not 10 minutes before. When Gentry got to the door and eventually spoke with Mr. Abels, we have a recording from dispatch from 911. It's the same operators that the police use. They'll key in their microphone and say, and they use a lot of 10 codes. This is badge number such and such. I'm, 10 this and 10 that, and they'll talk in that police talk. Well, a standard protocol you will hear is that when you make contact with somebody, you find out who they are. Do you have any identification? I'm sure that's a familiar thing with folks that get pulled over for speeding. Can I see your license and your registration? It's just what they do. So in this particular instance, you will hear the conversation that William Gentry had with dispatch. And it went something like this. I have a driver's license that I need you to run. And then he reads Alpha, which is the first letter of the person's last name. 124-485-490-130. And for the next minute or so, the dispatcher and Deputy Gentry have a conversation. And that conversation consists of, this is a Class E driver's license, Joseph Abels, also a motorcycle endorsement. The next thing that the dispatcher informs Deputy Gentry is that Mr. Abels has a probation officer, and Deputy Gentry says, what's that person's name? The dispatcher reads the name and says, would you like me to patch that through to your phone? Cell phone, radio. Deputy Gentry says, yes. Patch that through to my PX, which means phone. You will hear that Deputy Gentry was one of the deputies that did not use an earpiece. So instead of a wire that goes from the microphone to your ear, whatever you say gets broadcasted through your radio so that anyone within earshot can hear the conversation. Please have that number patched through to my PX. Those were the last words spoken by William Gentry. At about 7:56 p.m., this is about 9 to 10 minutes after Gentry and Lavender arrive. Gentry has been at Mr. Abel's house. Deputy Lavender is still talking with Ms. Naylor in the Pites, and they hear a series of gunshots. Lavender hears that, and they try to call Gentry on the radio. Are you there? Are you there? Lavender begins to take the same path that both Gentry and Ms. Naylor took up the side of the house to see what's going on. About that time, Russell Pites calls 911 a second time and says, I hear shots being fired. Gets his mother-in-law and his wife over by the side of the house to safety and talks to the 911 operator. It's at this point that Mario Santos, the guy that Mr. Abels called at 7:40, realizes that he's missed a call from Joseph Abels. So he picks up his phone and presses redial to the number that he has in his phone to Mr. Abels. Mr. Abels picks up the phone. Says, Joe, what's up? Now keep in mind their relationship has to do with cars. You broke down somewhere? You need a jump start? You stranded someplace? The response is, I'm in trouble. I just killed somebody. It's a cop. I'm scared. Santos is shocked, doesn't know why he got this information and this call in the first place, and says, Joe, you got to turn yourself in. Moments after the shots, Nicholas Sutherland, who has been listening on the radio, another deputy sheriff, comes up to the scene and pulls his patrol car, another SUV, up to the front on the roadway and the grass to Mr. Abels' house. He's now facing eastbound. He gets out of his car, now hearing gunshots fired, an address. He grabs his long gun and he gets out of his vehicle. As he gets out of his vehicle, he sees Deputy Lavender, who has now come around the side, the right side of the garage, and is at the corner of the house. So one's on one side and one's on the other. And of course, they're looking for William Gentry. What happens then, at that point, the evidence will show, is that the left garage door begins to open. And inside the garage is a running silver Chevy with Mr. Abels standing in the open driver's door. Sutherland and Lavender walk up, say, get to the back of the car, put your hands on the car. They don't know where Gentry is. Lavender watches Mr. Abels. Nick Sutherland goes around to the front door where he sees some sort of mass on the front porch, and it's William Gentry. At that point, Sutherland runs back and yells to Abels, get on the ground. And they handcuff him and put him in a car. Now the race is to save Deputy Gentry. Lake Placid Police Department has now shown up with two officers, Officer Cooper and Officer Owen. Officer Cooper runs to help Deputy Sutherland pull Gentry out of that small porch area so that they can work on him. Sutherland calls the radio, and you will hear the dispatch where he says he's been shot in the head, officer down, call 911. Officer Gentry is then airlifted to Lee County Hospital. He later dies of his wounds. He's been shot 4 times in the head, front to back from up to down. Detectives find a .22 caliber 8-shot revolver in the front seat of Mr. Abel's car, in the front passenger seat. Mr. Abel's cell phone is also in the front seat of the running car. Now, an autopsy is performed, and that autopsy manner of death is homicide. Dr. Nelson, who is the District 10 medical examiner, will testify that there were 4 bullet entry wounds into the head of William Gentry. One of them was at close range, the other 3 were at intermediate range, and he'll help explain what that means. But interestingly, in that cylinder of that 8-shot revolver, there were 6 fired rounds. Only 4 hit Deputy Gentry. You'll see in the evidence there are 2 holes in the front screen door, meaning that Gentry was inside and the door was closed. And there's a bullet strike on the front wall, garage wall, of Mr. Abel's house. There's no signs of struggle on Deputy Gentry. There's no cuts, no bruises, just the bullet wounds. Now, DNA. On that gun, the gun was sent to Florida Department of Law Enforcement, just like the gun was, but it's a different department. It's called biology. And the biology department swabs or takes swabs of firearms or any other object to see if that matches a known DNA profile. The DNA profile of Mr. Abels was recovered. The DNA profile of Deputy Gentry was recovered. So they have 2 complete profiles. So they have their genetic makeup, their identity, which is unique to every individual except for an identical twin. And on that revolver was the blood of Deputy Gentry. And on that revolver was also the DNA of Mr. Abels, whose gun it was. Deputy Gentry's blood, they also, in some cases, call that certain types of blood high spatter analysis, high velocity spatter. It's like a spray, is on Joseph Abel's license that's found on the floor of the porch. Now, Mr. Abels, you will see a video of this is recorded, audio and video recorded. You will see a police statement of Mr. Abels from that evening. And he recalls Miss Naylor coming over with what he calls a fake cat. Describes it as one of those toys that you buy that can purr and you put it in a little blanket and something that, you know, it's just a thing for a toy. And he tells him it kind of looked weird and kind of freaked me out when I saw that fake cat. And I don't know that lady. I've never seen her in my life. The woman that had lived behind him for 4 years. He recalls an officer of sorts walking up, seeing him through his back bedroom window, walking up. Describes him in a very dark black uniform. And then when questioned about what happened, did you remember giving your driver's license to the deputy? Doesn't remember that. Do you have a handgun or a firearm? I used to. Do you know what happened out there? Don't really remember. Blurry. I was kind of freaked out about that fake cat. Ladies and gentlemen, the state believes that the evidence will show that this was a premeditated murder of Deputy Sheriff William Jackson Gentry, Jr. Premeditation, the judge will give you the instruction. That's having thought about and deciding to kill. No particular time, doesn't have to be hiding behind the bushes, but here the evidence will show that Mr. Abel saw Deputy Gentry walk up the same path that Ms. Naylor, Deputy Lavender walked up. Said he saw him. And Mr. Abels knows he shot the cat. It'll show that the holster for that firearm that killed Deputy Gentry was sitting on the bed in that back bedroom. And it is an exact fit for that firearm. So that firearm was taken out of that holster. The holster was on the bed. Which means that gun was carried from that bedroom to the front door. And when Gentry was on the radio with the dispatcher and getting his phone out of his pocket, he was most vulnerable. The forensic evidence will show that Mr. Abels did not shoot the gun just one time. Not just twice, 3 times, not just 4 times, not 5 times, but 6 times. And this is a revolver where you have to squeeze the trigger to get the cylinder to rotate to fire the next round. 4 of those shots struck Deputy William Gentry. At the end of the evidence, the state will ask that you find that that was indeed premeditated murder of a law enforcement officer, and that it was indeed Mr. Abels who unnecessarily shot the neighbor's cat. Deputy Gentry had been dispatched to investigate the shooting of a cat, and his life ended in the line of duty. Thank you.
Mr. Vance, wish to make an opening statement. You may proceed. Counsel. 1968. 18-year-old young man Joseph Edward Abels enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. After he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, he was shipped to South Vietnam and was involved in numerous combat situations. Eventually, after being homeless, living with his mom, living in cars, he settled in beautiful Highlands County, Sebring, Lake Placid. Now on Sunday, May 6th of 2018, Susan Naylor, a neighbor of Mr. Abels, emerged on foot, walked up through the back of Mr. Abels' backyard, entered the small screened-in porch of Mr. Abels' home, holding her deceased cat in her arms, crying uncontrolled, yelling, demanding, commanding Mr. Abels an explanation for her cat being dead and as to whether or not he had in fact shot her cat. Mr. Abels tried to soothe her, even patting her arm at one point. Wasn't aggressive, talked with her, attempted to console her, And then eventually, Miss Naylor leaves that enclosed screened-in porch on foot and walks back the way that she came, through Mr. Abel's backyard with her dead cat in her arms. Talks to her neighbor, eventually calls her son-in-law, who lives about 5 minutes or so down the road. Her son-in-law, her daughter, and the neighbor all congregate outside with the cat. And eventually 911 is called, law enforcement arrive. And when law enforcement arrive, Deputy William Gentry and his deputy in training, Erica Lavender, arrive. They arrive in a patrol vehicle. That patrol vehicle parks in front of Miss Naylor's home. And as you can see from the map that was just before you during the state's opening, Miss Naylor's home faces the opposite way and is on the opposite street of Mr. Abel's home. One patrol vehicle, 2 deputies, 1 deputy, 1 female deputy in training. There's a brief exchange of information between those individuals that are waiting outside, and Deputy Gentry leaves those individuals and begins to walk on foot towards Mr. Abel's home. Through his backyard, towards the wooded, heavily treed, vacant lot line that abuts Mr. Abel's home, walks to the front of Mr. Abel's home, out of the earshot of his deputy in trainee, out of eyeshot of his deputy in trainee, to the front of Mr. Abel's home. And folks, in that moment in time, Mr. Abel's was back in Vietnam. For every second of every minute of every hour of every day counts. And in Mr. Abel's mind, he was in fear. He was in danger, in his mind, of an intruder, that being Deputy William Gentry, who he describes to law enforcement as seeing an individual in a dark uniform walking along the side of his house. An armed individual in a dark uniform walking along the side of his house. And again, he was in that moment back in Vietnam. And he did what he was trained to do. Folks, what he was awarded to do, what he was expected to do, what he was praised to do by the Marines. He defended himself because he was in fear. He defended himself because he thought he was in danger by an intruder. For Mr. Abels, in that moment,
It was kill or be killed. And he took the former. Thank you.